We do have to turn back to our agenda. We have the presentation from the findings of the Twinned Watershed project with the Koksilah environmental flows and the fish habitat. So we're letting in Jeff, are we? And Cheri?
Yes.
Oh, there you are. I can see you now. Thank you. So with that, welcome to the Cowichan Watershed Board meeting. So pleased to have you join us. Can we please, who should I turn to first, Cheri or Jeff? Who would you like to go first?
Sure, I can just say a couple things. Tom, did you have something before?
Yeah, I see your hand up there. Tom, did you want to do some introductory piece?
So Cheri, are you going to introduce Jeff? I just wanted to give a brief introduction for Jeff. I think most of the board probably knows you. Is this the right time, or do you want to do that? Or?
Sure. You go ahead. You go ahead, Tom. You can
go ahead, Tom. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd just like to say that I'm really happy to welcome Jeff Anderson here. He's the principal of Geomorphic Environmental Services, and Jeff was retained by the board using our develop flows on the Koksilah. And I just wanted to let the board know that his approach to this work has been really innovative and really kind of dug in to not only the water, but the relationship between the water and the habitat it flows through. And it involved extensive field work to support a SEFA modeling process and an accompanying meso habitat inventory. And I wanted to share that Jeff's report has been reviewed by what I consider to be real giants in the field: Ron Talmy, like Dave Wilford, John Rex, Mike Miles, Ian Jowett. It's really strong science. But the thing that I think is just as important is that Jeff, like in doing this work, really concentrated on knowledge transfer, working very closely with our local professional team in the Valley. And in fact, Cheri's representing that. But also all the people doing the work in the field, right? Who were all Indigenous workers, and we've really created like a team of experts here in the Cowichan Valley that will live in the Cowichan Valley, and that's not the usual approach like taken by consultants. And in my mind, this is like, we always talk about capacity building and knowledge transfer. This is what that looks like. And so not only was the work first class, and Jeff's going to talk about that, but I just wanted to acknowledge the extra time and effort that he took to really do a lot of teaching and a lot of training. So I'll leave it there. It's really been a pleasure working with Jeff, and I'm really happy he's here today to share a little bit of what we've learned.
Great, thanks, Tom. So for those of you I haven't met, I think I've met most of you, but I'm Cheri Ayers. I live on the Koksilah, and I'm from Cowichan area, and I've worked over the years in various capacities, but mostly my career has been with Cowichan tribes and the Hwitsum Nation people, doing salmon and fisheries work. So anyway, I wanted to just go back in time just a little bit, just for a tiny bit of context, and then I'm going to turn things over to Jeff. But basically, I wanted to show you this graphic. This is from a 2017 presentation that I gave to the Watershed Board when we first started talking about watershed health and Chinook in the Cowichan River. And we've kind of continued that on with this work that Jeff has done. So what we were talking about back then was how to recover the Chinook populations in the Cowichan. And we were looking at these factors that are really sort of process-based or components that make up a stool around the stability of the watershed and the health of the watershed. And so we were talking about hydrology, physical habitat, water quality, and biological communities. And we had this model, and I'm just going back a little bit with this so I can just give you a little bit of context, and we can talk about the work that's been done over the years and how we've kind of been moving along this road to get to where we are today. And it's really what you're going to see that Jeff's been working with us on is really exciting, because we've been able to take this kind of busy graphic, but focus in on hydrology, physical habitat, and biological communities. And the Watershed Board also did a lot of work on water quality on the Koksilah. And that's been reported on over the years. That's a partnership that MOE had with the Watershed Board. So anyway, I just wanted to remind you of that. And then what ended up happening with the Twinned Watershed project was that, and we've talked about, sorry, I read a little bit of a cold, it sounds like a lot of people do. Anyway, the Twinned Watershed project was a project between, initially between Cowichan tribes and Halalt, and the Watershed Board as a partner. And what we did was we decided we weren't going to compete for funding. And there was some really opportunistic money out there from the federal government under the BC Salmon Habitat Innovation and Restoration Fund. And we were really lucky. We got it. Its focus was more on the biological communities end of it. We were looking at salmon stock assessment, but we knew we had all this other work to do on hydrology and physical habitat. And the Watershed Board was able to garner a fair amount of money to do that piece. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So I just wanted to go back, like I said, back in time a little bit and say, this has been a continuum. We've been working on these pieces all the way along, and it's really exciting. And there's still a fair amount of work to do, but we're applying this methodology and this model to the Koksilah and the Chemainus River, and hopefully we'll start to look more closely at the Cowichan this way too. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. So maybe you can share your screen. Oh, there you go, Jeff. Thank you.
Hi, Cheri. Appreciate that backdrop. Turning to Jeff, please.
Thank you so much, Tom and Cheri, for the introduction. It's certainly been my pleasure to come and work on the Koksilah River, as for me, I grew up on Vancouver Island and spent my summers on the west arm of Shawnigan Lake every year and touring up to the Koksilah. And so it's been really gratifying for me to come back at this point in my career and participate and contribute to what you guys have going on there. So thank you for that. So what I'm going to do today is present, one second. There we go. My apology. You guys seen presenter mode or presentation mode? Seeing the right
We're
thing?
seeing presenter mode, Jeff.
Yeah, sorry, we do see your overview of notes. There we go.
Let me shift that up. 1 second. Just got to stop a share for half a sec.
No, it looks good now. Oh no.
Is that now the whole screen?
It looks
Excellent.
like it, yes.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do today is present the results from 3 different studies that took place. And as Cheri has mentioned, were the continuation of many years of conversation and studies that have been happening in the Koksilah. And so I'm going to start today out by talking a little bit about watershed integrity, watershed health, and environmental flows, and just a little bit about linking those together. We'll take an overview approach of the 3 studies that we did. And so I'll show some pictures and talk really high level. It's a little techie, but really I'm hoping to tell a story that that's coherent for everybody rather than share the technical details of one graph after another. We'll provide sort of a summary and overview of the 3 of those results together and how each of them complement each other, and then a little bit on some potential next steps. So I think one of the overriding themes that's coming out in everywhere, British Columbia, around the world, is just the notion that everything is connected. We're hearing this from Indigenous partners. We're hearing this in science. We're seeing this on the ground. We're starting to see impacts that we haven't seen before, and really starting to make the connection that everything is connected. We have inputs and we have outputs in our watershed. And, rivers are often talked about as the exhaust of the engine. with the watershed being the engine and the river being the exhaust of that engine. So whatever we put into it, whatever we burn, is really what's coming out. We can add people, and we can add climate change to that. And we're going to complicate that picture a little bit. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today, is just some of those complexities and nuances in and around watershed management. Before I go there, you know, there's been much talk about environmental flows in the last handful of years and what they are. There's many different types of environmental flows, and they're a type of science, if you will. And so it means there's different methods and different flavors. And I think the most holistic of those, this graphic is from the World Wildlife Fund. And one of the most holistic approaches to environmental flows is recognizing that there are 5 pillars to aquatic health. And this is a busy graphic, and really I'm just drawing everybody's attention to the top of the graphic here. I'm just going to see if I can pull up a pointer. I'm pulling your attention to the top, where we have hydrology, geomorphology, biology, water quality, and connectivity. And these 5 pillars together are really what compose the nitty-gritty, the building blocks of river health. And we can think about these as a report card. Much like in school, we want to be doing pretty good at everything. It'd be great if we're doing really good at a few things. Failing the odd thing is okay, but failing everything is not okay. And that's really the way to think about these 5 pillars right here. So to complement, you know, past and present work, to take an environmental flow perspective on the Koksilah River, we talked and came up with 3 different separate studies that we were going to do that each complemented one another. And so the first study that I'm going to present today is habitat condition, and that was done by looking at the mesohabitat, a geomorphology analysis, if you will. Then we're going to look at water supply, how much water is out there, and that's a desktop approach to environmental flows. Then we're going to look at water availability, and really what we mean by that is, how do the fish use that water? Is there enough? Is there too much? Is it too fast or too slow? And really get into that nitty-gritty a little bit. And at the bottom of this slide, I'm just indicating with the same colors as above that this study is touching on hydrology, geomorphology, biology, and connectivity in terms of those 5 pillars. And as Cheri mentioned, other studies are working on other components such as water quality. So the first of the 3 studies is habitat condition. And really what I'm going to do is, it's very techy, and I'm a scientist. So my study of my challenge, of course, is how to communicate the work that we do well. So I apologize if I'm fast or techy, but really I'm going to show some pictures, and just hopefully this will paint a picture of what was done. And so last summer, in between May and October, field crews went out and collected some information. And that information was really focusing on the physical habitat. And so what we did is we measured information at every single pool, riffle, and run that was out there, from the railway bridge upstream for about 6 kilometers. Really exhaustive work, but the details that come out of that work is really meaningful and really important. And so it was a necessary investment, if you will. Just for a little bit of context, you can see where the highway bridge, gravel pit, and Cowichan station is. And this is sort of some of that raw data. It's not quite interesting yet. It doesn't matter if you can see every one of those colors. Really what we're just starting to show is the assemblage of pools, riffles, runs, and whatnot throughout the system. One of the biggest epiphanies that we had in this work was realizing that there was a lot of one type of habitat. And that one type of habitat is what we're calling here a deep glide. And I'm guessing that in the summertime, this is a familiar look to many of you, where it seems very pool-like. Even though it's moving a little bit, it's kind of deep and slow and wide. And that's not it's an impacted habitat condition. It's not a natural condition. And this is one of the really big outcomes from this work, is starting to identify with these red arrows just how many deep glides there are out there at all of these different red arrow places. Sorry, you can see that my slide is a little bit messed up. So let's get to the end there. What we're showing right here is that 77% of the habitat in this 6 kilometers, right, the lower Koksilah River, is all the deep glides, all that picture that we saw. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail here. But this is really alarming, because this habitat type is not supposed to be there like that. It really should have pools and riffles and runs and other, you know, a couple other nuances, habitats that have a lot more proportionality, so that we have complexity and the type of things that the fish and the other organisms need to survive, if you will. So again, bit of a busy graph, but really what I want you guys to take from this graph is not the fine details, but this is looking at stream evolution. And stream evolution is very, very closely related with ecology, or how much ecology is available. Is it poor or is it excellent? And so the real take home here in each of these, in this graph, is just the actual shape of each of these rivers, right? This one's nice and U-shaped over here. We can see we have a little bit of a nick in the bottom where we have a thawag, or that speedy, fast part of the river. We have some lateral erosion on this shape right here. It's pretty boxy and square. And if we were to jump over to the other side, we can see that it's actually many channels and really lush ecology over here, right? Or some lush ecology with a meandering stream. And that's really the main take home from this graph. And what I want people to start to realize is that in the 6 kilometers that we surveyed, a lot of streams were landing over here in this sort of area. And we can see that it's referred to as degradation, or if you could read that, you'd see that it was saying degradation there. So the real take home here is that these stream evolution stages on this side of the river are really lacking both structure and complexity. And we can sort of see that particularly in this stage right here where it's fairly barren. Okay, and we'll get out of the weeds on that and look at a couple of these results. So this is a map of stream structure. And when we say structure, we're talking about woody debris, log jams, big boulders, anything that might have some sort of hydraulic purchase or interaction that creates dissolved oxygen, eddy lines, fast water and slow water. And what we can see here with the red and the yellow coloring is that there's a lot of poor and a lot of moderate areas within the lower Koksilah River that really don't have a lot of structure, right? There's very little woody debris in the Koksilah River, and that's because it's getting blasted out. We'll talk about that pretty soon. When we look at complexity, we see an even darker story. And when we say complexity, really what I mean here is side channels, a little off-channel pool, maybe a pool that's created by a log in the river where the main stem is fast, but there's a pool on the side of the river. All of those things are complexity, and complexity is a wonderful thing for rivers. So what we see here is there's hardly any complexity in the lower Koksilah River. And so together there's very little structure and there's very little complexity is one of the outcomes that we realized when we did this work. So this is from the US Department of Agriculture. They produced this a few years ago, and they're really talking about the same kind of things and doing the same type of science. And what this graphic is indicating over here is here's the river, and this is a similar shape to the river that we saw a lot of places. In this case, there's a road and a levee on either side. They don't have to be there. Could be a railway, could be a little ways back. But really what this graphic is showing is that when we lose our structure and our complexity, the river tends to erode down. And when the river erodes down, we have this blue dotted line, which is the water table. The water table moves down with it. And what we can see over here is that what happens when the water is concentrated inside the river and it becomes incised or degraded is there's a disconnection between the water table and the river. And so all of those floodplains, those farmers and whatnot, having to drill a little deeper or pull a little harder for that water as it starts to drop further down. And this is something that can be fixed with restoration. But the important thing is identifying, when these problems are happening and more importantly, why they're happening. And so we can see on the right-hand side here, they talk about a fire hose effect. And this is just like blasting the, pine needles out of the driveway, right? Is all of that structure and complexity has really been blasted out of the lower Koksilah River. When we talk about deep glides in that shape, I've used this yellow dotted line to sort of indicate, right here what that might look like. And just really giving an indication of, this is that shape that we saw on this graphic right here. And so the red dotted line is really indicating, most of the river that we surveyed has these shapes in it right here, right? And this is sort of really similar in here or right here to the picture that we just looked at. So really the main take home from there is when we think about stream evolution and the shape of the river, how maybe it used to be historically or how it is now, what we really know in terms of ecology is that some of these stages have really great ecology and are wonderful for fish, and other stages are not. And we're sort of indicating that right here and realizing with the mesohabitat study that quite a bit of the lower Koksilah River is sitting in this unhappy zone, if you will, this unhappy river shape that's not lending itself to structure and complexity, which is what fish need. We need to slow that water down. So that right there concludes the first study that we looked at, habitat condition. The next study was a desktop study looking at water supply, or how much water is there, what's coming in through precipitation and making it into the river. So again, you know, this is really techie, and so rather than a bunch of slides with some text, I'm going to walk you guys through this picture right here, this graphic, and this really holds a lot of the information that I'll talk about. And first off, this data is from the Water Survey of Canada, the water survey gauge in the Koksilah River, and I'll talk through what this is, so don't worry about squinting or making sense of this stuff quite yet. This is a 68-year record, so it goes back a long time. But one of the important things to recognize is that a lot of development had happened in the watershed before 1950, 1968, when they established this gauge, or when, you know, good data started coming in from the gauge. And so I really want you guys to understand that we might be looking at impacts in the historical data. So the historical data might not tell the true story, is what I'm saying. And I want us all to be open to that as we look at some of these results. We can't say that the impacts were there, and we can't say they weren't there. But when we look at the development of the railroad, the railway, and the lower Koksilah River floodplain, we could imagine that those impacts were there before this hydrology record began. So this is part of a low flow study. And what we're looking here, as you've probably put together, is these are the 12 months of the year, and this all represents the long-term data. So it's all been boiled into this one graph. On the bottom, this is called the sustained 7-day low flow, which means the lowest flow for 7 consecutive days in any given month. And so we see there's a whole bunch of data because it's all that monthly data for all of those years. And it's showing the lowest flows of that month. So what's the ground floor in terms of water and what we'd expect? The top graph that corresponds with that, what we've done is we've lumped this into climate normal windows that we see over here. The Canadian climate normal windows group 30-year windows and look at the trend inside those 30-year windows to get an idea if climate change is having an impact. And if it is it positive or negative? And then what is that? So what we're able to see in the top graph is what some of those trends are. So let's walk us through that. We can see on the top graph that everyone, you're probably squinting and can't read that, and that's fine. But each one of these 4 vertical dates is one of the climate windows right here that we see on the bottom. So on the left-hand side is the earliest one of 1960 to 1990, and the right-hand side is the most recent, 1990 to 2020. And so these are this is the decadal response. And so back when the instrument record began, you know, January low flows were in and around 3 cubic meters per second is what's on that left-hand side. And they've increased over time. And then, you know, we can see that this changes from one to the next. These are similar to the monthly record right down below, as you can see. But really what I want to draw our attention to is those signals that are increasing and then those signals that are decreasing. So one of the things that we can see here is that November through March, excluding December for some reason, but by and large, the wintertime is increasing in its lower flow. There's more water available in the wintertime than there used to be. So we're looking at low flows, but we can still see that the total flows are increasing, and that's fine. More water, you know, may bring floods, but more water in a way is, well, let me just pause that thought. The other thing that we see here is the ones that are going down. And this is really what's brought us all together, is looking at low flows and looking some of the flow issues in the Koksilah River. And what we can see here very clearly is from May until October, the flows are going down. Some of them are going down like July at a much, much steeper rate. But the really important thing to recognize is that 1 month after another, they're all dropping. And so this information would suggest that, you know, the next climate normal window would probably be lower again if we were to take that trend and believe it or run with it. And so this is really indicating that, you know, climate change is unfolding in interesting ways. In this particular case, this might be an example of rain on snow. So rain moving a little further into the wintertime, into November, and, you know, both increasing in magnitude, more rain, but a little bit changing in timing so that rather than holding the water in as snow, that water is moving through the watershed as rain in the wintertime. That might explain some of the floods. But at the same time, it's really maybe suggesting that timing and temperature are part of why there's more flow in the wintertime. And again, these other results are suggesting, less precipitation and less water in the floodplain is resulting in lower flows in the summertime. So that was the historical side of looking at water supply. What is there and what are the trends that are happening? The desktop environmental flow that we looked at was really taking that information and applying some fish periodicity, right, or life stages and species, and starting to understand, okay, Chinook and steelhead, fry and rearing, Chinook adult, migration coming through riffles, so on and so forth. And we started to take these pieces of information and combine them all together with this historical hydrology to come up with a model. And so really what that looks like right here is we took 5 different models from different places around the Pacific Northwest, including, the US and Montana. And we put those together in here and we took the results from all of them and we grouped them into min, mean, average, and max. And so that's what we see right here. And then from that information, we have made a synthetic line, which is the red dotted line. And so this synthetic line we could think about as the conservation flow for the Koksilah. This is not model results, but this is us using professional judgment, developing a line for the Koksilah based on the results of 5 other approaches. And so what we can see if we look on the left-hand side is the blue in the background is the long-term hydrograph and the long-term flow that's there. And then this is showing that some of those results had really, really high results and other ones were quite low. And the red dotted line is sort of taken from each. It's taken some of the high flows. As we see here, it's on the maximum line. And then we're down here borrowing from the average line before we drop down to the minimum for a little while. And so we've really used these 5 different models to construct something that is more appropriate for the Koksilah River. And part of the reason we've done this is we want this to be able to guide sort of a grassroots approach to guide the people towards understanding what restoration and why might happen. And so this is part of the tools that I believe will help the community with that. And so where we go from here is to, right, so right now the blue line is the same as the red line before. So the blue line is the Koksilah conservation flow, if you will. And this red line at the bottom is what's called a critical flow. And critical flow is a coined phrase that's used in the environmental flow world. It can be different numbers, and it can even be a controversial thing. But ultimately, what critical flows are suggesting is that this is the flow that you do not want to go below. It is the ground floor. It's the line in the sand. And we can argue that it could be higher or lower, absolutely. And we can see on the left-hand side, this critical flow is at 2 cubic meters per second. On the right-hand side of the graph, this is 20% of the mean annual discharge, or the long-term average discharge over the whole record. And so we can see that we brought the Koksilah conservation flow along that line because we wouldn't really want to go below it. Even though we can see all this airspace and we know that there's a deficit, this is still where we planned that line to be. So if we remove that forward from what is out there to what could be, right, to how we might be able to restore this, really what we can do is start to think about how to restore base flow. And so what we're showing on this graph right here, with the blue dotted line, is 5% mean annual discharge, or a near-term target for restoration. And with just above that, with the dark blue line, is sort of a midterm or long-term, depends on how we want to look at that, goal for restoring base flow. And we see up here the red dotted line, and we know from the previous graph that this is where the conservation flow actually went along, was right along this line. And so what I'd like you guys to take from this is that it's a pretty modest leap, right, to come up to 5% mean annual discharge. We can see 5% right here on the right-hand side, and that corresponds to half of a cubic meter per second, and 10 CMS as cubic meters per second, or 10% MAD as a long-term goal, we can see corresponds to 10% here and 1 CMS on the left. And the reason I'm talking about the numbers is that's going to come up in a few minutes, right? So I just want you guys to make the parallel. And so this is the last slide for study number 2, and this is really the deliverable, or the take home from study number 2, is that, you know, the needs of the fish when we look at the long-term hydrology and the species and their life history needs, whether that's migrating or rearing, these results are really suggesting that, you know, we want to see more water in the river. We want to see 5% and 10% in the river as practical targets. And, you know, that bigger picture is that there's a long ways to go to 20%. Some people might argue that southeastern Vancouver Island streams never had that much water. Other people might argue that it's the instrument record that would lead you to that understanding, and the instrument record might actually be holding the impacts within it, right? There may have been more water here 300 years ago, let's say. That story is held in oral histories and nothing more would be my guess. And so if we're to move from there to the third and final study, the last thing we looked at was water availability. And so this was a field-based environmental flow study. And this was, the first two studies are fantastic stuff and contribute a lot. We really hit this one with a lot of vigor. And we put an internationally reputable study design on the table, an approach that we used. And we really rang the bell with this one in terms of doing some excellent science to really demonstrate what is and what is not with the flow levels and fish needs, if you will. So this particular one was a field-based approach that was called an incremental in-stream flow methodology. Bit of a mouthful, but all that really means is modeling across the whole range of flows. It's not one number, but you know the results for the fish across any range of flows that you want to look at. We used a software package called the System for Environmental Flow Analysis, or SEFA, which has really taken over the market of in-stream flow. I guess you could say it's the package of choice. And this is what's called a transect-driven approach, where we went out in the field and we surveyed 17 transects, and then we went back and we resurveyed those over and over and over. And when I say we, I really mean the KSF crew or the Koksilah Forestry Services. Nope. I'm stumbling on that, Cheri.
Cowichan, yeah.
Thank you so much. So Cowichan Forestry Services is who did the majority of this work. And we'll see a couple of pictures of that right here. So the field design, staff from Cowichan Tribes, from Cowichan Watershed Board, from Ministry, myself, and a few others all went out in the field, and we walked and we talked and we looked at a lot of places. We talked about what the needs of the fish are and what some of those pinch points are, and what type of study design would really lend itself to understanding these impacts or these pinch points. This is what that looked like. This is a transect that these folks are standing at. You can see there's a measuring tape that's strung across, and they're collecting information with these instruments. That information sort of looks like this on the top when you graph it out and whatnot. You know, again, for this presentation, the colors don't matter as much as, you know, this is what sort of some of the modeling results look like. This is what that model would look like if we just kind of put it in two-dimensional space. We can see a whole bunch of cross sections. They're all different shapes and whatnot. This is how that biological information gets included. And this is really scrappy to look at, but really what we're looking at is the preference of depth, the preference of velocity, and the preference of substrate. And those are the three metrics that really drive a line like this that might tell you at what flow level you have a certain amount of habitat. And so this particular graph right here is showing that at 0.1 CMS, or 1% mean annual discharge, there's about 6 square meters of habitat available for steelhead fry rearing. Again, those details aren't so important to this study as much as sharing with you that this is the type of study that was done and the results that came from that. And that's what I'm going to share with you right here. So when we talk about environmental flows, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's the good, bad, and the indifferent, right? We can take a very light approach or a vigorous approach. And what we decided here was to look at 5 different things as part of this assessment. We looked at insect production in riffles. We looked at steelhead fry rearing, coho fry rearing, Chinook passage through riffles, as well as siltation of those deep glides, because they were 77% of the stream and it was really slow moving. And we wanted to know if that was a pinch point as well. And then the main take home I want for everybody here, and before I show some numbers, is that in the middle, where we say a multi-value flow range, this is not one number. Environmental flows are not one number. Insect production has a flow preference that it needs. Coho fry rearing in the summertime has a flow preference, which is different than autumn or winter flow preferences, and so on and so forth. And so it really is a complicated thing to come up with a flow for a river that has multiple species if what we're looking for is healthy, sustainable rivers. So if I was to put numbers to this and then walk everybody through it, insect production wants 1 to 60% mean annual discharge, right? Sorry, 1 to 6% cubic meters per second, or 10 to 60% mean annual discharge. Steelhead fry rearing and coho fry rearing can operate between 2 to 7% mean annual discharge, or below 1 cubic meter per second. Chinook passage through riffles takes a little bit more. It takes a full cubic meter per second, or 10% mean annual discharge. So that's quite a high need, along with insect production. And then siltation happens anytime below 3% MAD. So the water slows down enough that those glides start to have silt deposited in the bottom below 3% MAD. And really in the scale of ecology, you know, that will get washed away again in autumn floods and whatnot. But it doesn't negate the issue that it's happening and it's unnatural, if you will. And so really this is showing that somewhere, give or take, between 2 and 15% MAD is where most of the needs for these 5 things are at. And that's really what I want to take home, is that it's not one number, but it's a range of numbers. So if I was to summarize all of these studies in just the last few slides here, I would bring us back to this point. And really the fire hose effect, now that we've heard a little bit more, I want us to consider that a lot of the Koksilah is this shape right here. And just like this picture, there's not very much structure and there's not very much complexity. These backfilled side channels in this picture, this was the complexity here. This was the side channels that would have registered as complexity in the mesohabitat study. And any woody debris that would be inside this picture would have registered as structure in the mesohabitat study. And so really what I want us to focus on is, you know, when we take away that stream area like here and we concentrate it right here, we have a loss of water table. We get low water in the summertime, right? And so this is the everything is connected part, because this phenomena does not begin in the lower watershed. This phenomena begins in the top of the watershed with the very first raindrop that comes in. And so watershed management, or river management, is watershed management, if you will. So where we can go from there, we can seek to further understand current conditions, much like we're talking about today. Other high-valued tributaries high up in the watershed, and really start to understand what's out there for structure and complexity. And we can start thinking about restoration potential, right? Looking at spatially explicit places with process-based restoration by the people, for the people. And what I mean by that is Cowichan tribes and Cowichan tribe staff doing some of the work that we've seen here in today's presentation, and using that work to develop restoration techniques that can be done in tributaries by the Cowichan tribes by hand, and non-engineered outcomes, with you will, holistic stuff. And so just to bring it back to this complicated diagram, we know that we're right here in this red shade with the shape of the river and the ecology that's there. And what we really want to do is transition or transform the river into these other river stages that are just a little bit healthier and had a little bit more ecology to offer. And at the same time, what happens is these are also the river stages that slow the river down and let the floodplain get activated. And when we have an activated floodplain, this is when, you know, we're not having infrastructure damage. The floods are no longer threatening, but rejuvenating the floodplains and the fields and whatnot. So last comment I would say is that rivers need space, and having a riparian corridor cannot be understated in terms of its value for everything being connected. Poor channel condition, like the deep glides, you really need to restore the river health in those places. There's a lot more ecology that could be offered in the Koksilah than what those are. And with summer low flows, a near-term target of 5% MAD and a little bit longer target of 10%, I think is something that really needs to be considered strongly if the notion is to maintain water, maintain environmental flows for both people and nature. So with that, it was really sunny, really pretty, and we had a lot of fun while we're out there. And I would open the floor up to any questions that anybody has.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for walking us through all of that information. It's really good to see the amount of data, because there was just so much complexity in trying to find the way forward, right? That to be able to get better data and a better understanding of the state of the river and the impacts, and that hard thinking going forward around how we support meeting the sort of targets that help the river survive, and correspondingly us as well, as our close connection to the river. So turning to the board, if you want to close your share screen, then I'll be able to see everybody, please. And then as we're doing that, just looking around the table, I know it's a lot of information to digest, and I think it's leading us towards some better thinking about how we can go forward to support the Koksilah River. I'm looking around, any hands up? Everybody seems to be digesting a whole lot of information here, I think. Allison, I'll turn to you, please.
I just want to say thank you so much, Jeff. I thought I read your report and I was really thrilled about the real focus on whole of watershed restoration. And I guess recognizing that the project was really focused on the lower river, I am wondering from a restoration point of view what that means in terms of the upper watershed, and what kind of information do we need in order to move forward on that front, because that seems to be a bit of a gap, what's going on in the upper watershed. And I'm also interested in the issue of road density. I know that we have a fairly dense road system in the watershed. What would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Allison. What I would say to restoration is, when we think about the graphic that had the fire hose effect on it, is restoration of the lower watershed this might not be intuitive, but restoration of the lower watershed really needs to start in tributaries and the headwater. Because there's just so much water in the lower watershed that the stream's not able to maintain structure and complexity. It's telling us that. And so the lower watershed is where this project needed to start, I believe, right? Because that is where the low flow is, that is where water abstractions are happening, and it's a very obvious point to start. But what this information has shown us is that, in fact, everything is connected, and this does need a whole of watershed approach. And so similar information to this, like the mesohabitat particularly, and stream temperature, food type information further up in the watershed and in the tributaries would be fantastic information to support this effort. The intensive studies of the environmental flows and the transects and whatnot, no, it doesn't necessarily make sense to just try and push all of that work everywhere. But the more rapid protocols, like looking at temperature and looking at mesohabitat, definitely turn up a lot of critical information. And Cowichan Watershed Board is certainly busy thinking about, next steps of how to continue this type of information and keep investing. Very astute observation with the road density. Agreed, it is high. The Salmon Explorer through the Pacific Salmon Foundation, right, is a great tool for looking at these types of metrics, and it lists roads as high. Roads move water more quickly than most other surfaces, and the Koksilah is a flashy watershed. And so undoubtedly there's a connection between road density and the rate at which water moves into the watershed, and that flashiness might be interpreted as flooding and infrastructure damage. These are certainly big questions, and I think it goes without question that if you could roll back the road density, you would slow down the water, but that instantaneously travels across several sectors and so on and so forth. But it's the right conversation to be having, that's for sure.
Hajka, thank you for that. Further questions, comments? Turning to the board. David Slade, please.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was a really a lot of science presented in a very accessible way. So thank you for that. The question I would have is the suggestion that one stream width on either side of the river is an appropriate buffer for a riparian zone. And I know that there's some stretches of the upper Koksilah where you can almost jump across the stream channel. And so I'm thinking, you know, a riparian area from a significant water course like the Koksilah is, that is, you know, 5 meters, is almost like nothing. And it seems to me that it's a pretty low bar. Any comments on that?
Yeah, so the average width of the river in the lower Koksilah, I think, is 35 to 45 meters, right? When you look at bankful width rather than the wetted width in the summertime. And so that's certainly the number that you would start with. And so one channel width, for the record, is the minimum suggestion. When you look at it, and depends on, it's sort of that graphic of channel evolution. When you're in the lower watershed and you're in a floodplain, the river wants to travel into several channels and expand. And the moment you have 2 channels, that width is all of a sudden much wider, because it's the first channel plus what's in between them plus the next channel. And it's almost multiplicative, right? Where you really quickly end up with a very wide floodplain riparian. So in a way, I needed to put a number that wasn't shocking in there. And 50 meters is a pretty good starting point for the conversation in most places. But to your specific point, on a floodplain in a lower watershed, the more the merrier. No question about it.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that response and question. Turning to the board, any further questions or comments at this point? I'm not seeing any other hands up, but this is such a valuable opportunity. I see your hand, Tom, just make this comment. It's such a valuable opportunity to start gathering data, because I know it's been such a, in some ways, you know, a hand-wringing exercise to figure out, like, what is it we can do in terms of helping Koksilah stop low. And so just to be able to have more data and more information about the status of the river and continuing to move forward, that it helps us to do that thinking, that planning, the points of intervention, and how we best be one and connected with the river as well. Tom, I see your hand, and then Cheri as well, please.
Sure, thank you, Chief Hwitsum. So I have a couple questions, Jeff, and I hope they're fair ones. The first one would be, what was the most surprising thing that this work revealed to you? And I guess the second one would be, what do you think is the obvious next step in order for us to keep building an understanding of the watershed?
Sure, both fair questions. The most surprising thing to me was probably the deep glides, and it was very confusing at first to understand what they were. And once we reconciled what they were and realized that they were the product of old sediment wedges or sediment slugs from landslides a long time ago, just constantly and slowly working their way down the river. And you guys have probably watched this your whole lives, or the whole time you've been in the watershed, or much of it. And so those deposits are creating the deep glides, because those deposits sort of are high up, and then it backwaters that water. And that unto itself is fine, but it was surprising that it was 77% of the lower watershed, and that it had very little ecological value to offer. And so in a way, it was surprising, but more than anything, it was actually disheartening, right? To see such a beautiful river have inappropriate and poor ecology in an area, the floodplain, the lower river, that actually should be the best ecology that that river has to offer. Yeah, so especially for me coming from Vancouver Island and just knowing the Koksilah, that was a little hard to realize, I guess you could say. And then obvious next steps, I think, you know, really transitioning this type of work to tributaries, you know, getting Cowichan tribes and KFS out there to be able to continue this type of work, again, particularly the meso habitat. It's such a brilliant tool to explore and identify what is and what is not there, that it's almost like forward operations, right? You can use that to explore and then invest in more stuff when you realize, you know, something is degraded. But I think the headwaters and the tributaries are an imperative focus. And I believe that restoration of headwater and tributary habitat is probably also imperative. Slowing the water down and spreading the water out, I think, is probably the only thing that's going to prevent floods and prevent the loss of structure and complexity. And these are big problems that require big answers. And that's why, we're using language like whole of watershed and whole of government. It's going to take a lot of commitment to bring that to fruition. But I don't say that lightly. It's also very practical to tackle one tributary at a time and make great progress, right? And one tributary at a time is really probably what the watershed's ready for.
Right, Scott. I'm going to turn to Cheri and then also to Lori. Lori, do you want to, I see your hand up. Cheri, do you mind? We'll just turn to Lori first and then we'll go to you. To you, Lori, please.
Oh, thank you, Chief. I've been distracted with different things, but I have been trying to pay attention, and I just have a question for Jeff, and it could be repetitive. I'm curious on the part of Koksilah where the farmer has actually cut off, if he toured any of that, where the farmer actually, the river's cut off in the tennis courts there. So I just wondered if there was any investigation there.
I wouldn't say that this work was approached as an investigation, right, where we'd heard of an issue of a complaint and went and looked at it. But in doing the work itself, I think I probably know where you're talking about, where with some of the imagery that we've worked with, you can see where there are old flood channels or side channels and whatnot. And to me, that is a brilliant location, not the person's property, but this topic is a brilliant topic for community-led grassroots restoration, right? These are hard things to talk about and hard things to get at when it is somebody's property. But when this is what the community wants, there will be a way to figure out how to, change that stream evolution, that stream shape to include those side channels that once were, right?
Yeah, I think a perfect opportunity to have community involved in those small channels. We have another one that's up by the co-op gas station as well that connects up. There's all kinds of little ones that people don't know that they are connected to the bigger picture. But I think that even part of Cowichan Bay Road, the flooding, I think a large part of that flooding is that the channels that have been rerouted or blocked is contributing to, well, first of all, I don't think the road probably shouldn't have gone there, but that's where it is now. But yeah, to do that education piece for farmers and homeowners would be really good. And I agree with the grassroots is usually really good. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it with educating farm owners and homeowners, Lori. That's where an action like that has to start.
Right, Scott. We'll turn to Cheri and look to just wrap this section up. There's much more to be discussed. I think introducing all of this data is going to help us in ways we don't even completely understand yet in terms of next steps. So very thankful for that. And I'll turn to Cheri, please.
Yeah, so I just wanted to thank you all for your time today, and just a last couple parting comments about the next steps piece. Just to let you know, we are collaboratively working amongst the staff at the CBRD and Cowichan tribes to talk about these issues and to talk about where there's some synergies between some of the flood management work and the work that we've been doing. And so that's happening. We have a meeting coming up to kind of a more discussion about how we would move collectively forward and make sure that the data that we're collecting is being used in the different projects that are going on, and that we're not duplicating work or that applying for the same funding, that kind of thing. So BC SHRIF money, as I mentioned earlier, is also continuing to fill the picture. We've added in some further data collection on peak flow analysis, as well as some information on kind of what we can do around process-based restoration. So Jeff is working on another piece, which once we're done, we can present as well, around what might be some of the opportunities for restoration in the Koksilah. And then also there's this connection that has been made in this project that I just want to bring up as my last sort of comment, is about the connection between the high flows and the low flows. And, Jeff's work was really focused on, environmental flows in the low flow time of the year. And what we were saying is that, this deep glide habitat, and also the issues around structure and complexity and the shape of the river that we see in all of our rivers here, this real, sort of bellied square where the water table is disconnected from the surface of the land. That's something that is a result of high flows, of peak flows. And we need to talk more about that and look at the whole watershed, pull in the upper watershed partners into the conversation as best we can, and as much as we can, to work together on trying to solve this, because it is going to take all of us and the relationship of the whole watershed. We're not going to be able to solve this by, Section 88 orders turning off the taps. We need to kind of address this from a larger perspective. So thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And Jeff, thanks for zooming in. And nice to see all of you again. And hopefully we'll have more to report soon.
Hi, Cheri. And hi, Jeff, thank you so much. This is such important work that I think, again, reflects that we've got to find ways to make good decisions, and getting more data and understanding better what the interconnectedness and the whole of watershed thinking moving forward. It just continues to make more and more sense when we see the science as well as the understanding of the teachings of our people with respect to the interconnectedness and the need to have to be that connected with our waterways and our watershed. So really appreciate your work. This is so valuable. And so just lifting my hands up, thank you, Jeff and Cheri, both for being here with us today and spending as much time as you did with this. And I know there's going to be more opportunity in terms of the sort of analysis that can support us moving forward with respect to how we make the sort of interventions with respect to restoration in our watershed over time. So very thankful for that. Yeah, oh, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.